He threw the ladle at her feet before she even opened her mouth. Not a mistake. Not an accident. He looked straight at her, this hollow-cheeked woman with mud caked on her boots and a satchel held together by a single fraying strap, and he threw it. The tin ladle hit the dirt and spun twice, landing between them like a line he was daring her to cross. "Kitchen's not a charity house," Grady Toland said, loud enough for every man in the yard to hear. "And I don't take orders from beggars." The laughter came fast and mean. Marin Holloway didn't flinch, didn't step back. She just looked at that ladle in the dirt, and something shifted behind her eyes. Something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, but lived somewhere painful between the two. If you were standing in her worn-out shoes that August afternoon in 1884, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this one speak to something deep in you, if you believe that quiet people sometimes carry the loudest kind of strength, then hit that subscribe button right now and ring the bell so you never miss what comes next. And when you finish watching, drop a comment telling me the city and country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that ranch yard and to the woman nobody expected to change everything. She had been walking for 4 days. That was the fact nobody in the yard knew, and nobody bothered to ask. 4 days across open frontier land in the worst heat that part of Wyoming had seen in 11 years. She'd run out of water somewhere around the second afternoon, rationed the last of a dry biscuit sometime before dawn on the third day, and had kept putting one foot in front of the other, not because she was brave, she would have told you herself she wasn't particularly brave, but because stopping wasn't a choice she could afford to make. Marin was 31 years old, though she looked older in the way that hard years aged a person faster than calendar years ever could. Her hair, dark brown with a streak of early gray at the left temple that she'd stopped trying to hide 2 winters back, was pulled into a knot at the back of her neck. Her coat, too heavy for summer but the only one she owned, was folded over her arm because wearing it in the heat would have killed her faster than the sun. She had $2.14 in the bottom of that satchel, wrapped in a handkerchief her mother had embroidered before the fever took her. She had not spent a single cent of it because $2.14 was the kind of money you kept for a moment when there was no other option left, and Marin had not yet arrived at that moment. She had arrived instead at Redstone Ranch. The gate was open when she reached it, which she took as neither a good sign nor a bad one, just a fact. A weathered wooden arch overhead, the name carved into it in letters that someone had once painted red, but which had mostly chipped away to bare wood. Beyond the gate, a long dirt path stretched toward a cluster of buildings. A main house, 2 bunkhouses, a barn that needed new boards on the south wall, and a cookhouse set off slightly to the left with a rusted tin chimney pipe poking out of the roof. It was the cookhouse she noticed first, not because she was calculating anything, not yet, but because she had spent most of her life paying attention to where food was made, the way other people paid attention to where money was kept. She had walked through the gate and about 40 feet down the path when the first man spotted her. He was young, maybe 19, sitting on a fence post with a piece of straw between his teeth. He stared at her with the open, uncomplicated curiosity of someone who hadn't yet learned to disguise his reactions. Then he turned his head and called out, not unkindly, but not quietly either. "Grady? Hey, Grady! There's a woman out here." Several things happened in the next 2 minutes that Marin would think about later, alone, replaying them the way you replay moments that brand themselves into memory, whether you want them to or not. 6 men drifted toward her from different directions, the way ranch hands did when anything broke the monotony of the afternoon. They weren't threatening, exactly, but they weren't welcoming either. They watched her with the specific kind of attention that men gave to something unexpected arriving in a space they considered theirs. And then Grady Tollins came out of the bunkhouse. She recognized his type before he opened his mouth. She had seen men like Grady her entire life, men who had been given a small piece of authority and had confused it with something larger and more permanent. He was somewhere in his 40s, stocky through the shoulders, with a foreman's swagger that he wore like a second skin. His face was the kind of face that smiled a lot without the eyes participating. He looked her up and down once, slowly, the way you'd look at something you were deciding whether was worth the energy of dealing with. Then he walked to the cookhouse doorway, picked up the ladle that was hanging just inside the frame, and threw it at her feet. The sound it made hitting the dirt was small. The silence that followed it was not. "Kitchen's not a charity house," he said, "and I don't take orders from beggars." Marin looked at the ladle. She looked at the mud on it, mixing now with the dust of the yard. She thought, with a strange detachment, that it was a decent ladle, heavier gauge than most, the kind that held up over a fire without warping. Someone had paid good money for it once, and didn't know how to treat what they had. "I'm not asking for charity," she said. Her voice was quiet. It wasn't quiet because she was scared. It was quiet because she had learned a long time ago that raising your voice in a yard full of men who were already laughing at you accomplished nothing except making them laugh louder. "Let me cook supper," she said. "One meal. If it's not worth eating, I'll leave and you'll never see me again. If it is—" She paused, not for dramatic effect, but because she was genuinely working through the terms even as she spoke them. "Then you let me stay on. A bed and 3 meals a day in exchange for cooking. That's all I'm asking." Grady stared at her. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He turned to the men around him and grinned, and the grin asked them to share in something at her expense. And they did. "You hear that, boys?" He said it loud, projecting it like a man who liked the sound of his own performance. "Little lady wants to cook for us." Someone laughed. Then someone else. The young man on the fence post, the one who'd called out when he spotted her, had the grace to look at the ground. "Last trail cook we had couldn't keep the beans from burning," said a voice from somewhere in the back. "What makes you think she's going to do better?" "She doesn't look like she could feed herself," said another, and this got the biggest laugh because it was the meanest observation and the one closest to visibly true. Marin stood in the center of that laughter and let it wash over her. She didn't smile to make them feel better. She didn't crumble to make them feel powerful. She just waited. She was good at waiting. She had waited out harder things than this. Callum Mercer heard the commotion from inside the main house, where he had been sitting at his desk with 2 months of account ledgers, and the growing, specific misery of a man watching numbers tell him a story he didn't want to hear. He came to the window first, a habit, not cowardice, and looked out at the yard. He saw the woman. He saw his foreman's performance. He saw his crew burning an afternoon on cruelty instead of work. He saw also something in the woman's posture that caught at him. The absolute unmovable stillness of a person who had run out of options but had not run out of dignity. Callum was 44 years old. He had built Redstone Ranch with 12 years of brutal work and 2 loans he was still paying back. He had buried a wife, lost a season's worth of cattle to fever the previous winter, and spent the last 6 months watching his crew deteriorate the way crews did when the food was bad and the morale was worse. His last cook had quit in April. The man before that had been drunk more often than not. He had been rotating the cooking duties among the hands since May, and the results had been, without exception, dismal. He went outside. "Grady," he said it flatly, not loudly. Grady heard the tone and stopped talking mid-sentence. Callum walked across the yard and stood in front of the woman. Up close, he could see more clearly what he'd read from the window, the exhaustion that went down to the bone, the kind you earn through days, not hours. He could also see her hands, which were resting at her sides, still and capable looking in the way of hands that had worked hard and long. "You said you can cook," he said. "Yes." "For 20 men?" "Yes." He looked at her for a moment that stretched past comfortable. "What's your name?" "Marin Holloway." "Where'd you come from?" She held his gaze. "East of here. Before that, further east. I had a way station with my father, outside of Cheyenne, for 11 years. We fed travelers, hundreds of them, over the years. All kinds. With all kinds of problems." She paused. "He died last November. The station had to be sold." Something about the way she said it, no performance in it, no request for sympathy, just the flat recitation of facts, made Callum believe her more than he might have believed a more polished story. "What's in that kitchen right now?" Grady said from behind him, his voice gone from mocking to something more specifically hostile. "Is flour that's been sitting since March, beans that nobody wants to eat again, salt pork that's 3 weeks old, and whatever scraps are left from yesterday's disaster. She can't make a meal out of that." He said it to Callum, but he said it about Marin in her hearing, which was a specific kind of rudeness, the kind that treated a person as though they were too unimportant to be addressed directly. Marin turned and looked at Grady Tollins for a long moment. There was no heat in the look, which was somehow more unnerving than anger would have been. "Let me see the kitchen," she said. Grady opened his mouth. Callum held up one hand, a small gesture, but Grady read it right and closed his mouth. "Show her," Callum said. What Marin found in the Redstone cookhouse was, by any reasonable measure, a problem. Grady wasn't wrong about the inventory. He had described it accurately, which was the most charitable thing she could say about him. The flour had been stored improperly in a barrel near the east wall, where the afternoon sun hit it, and it had gone slightly stale. The beans were dried and would need more time than she had if she soaked them normally. The salt pork was, as advertised, 3 weeks old, which meant she needed to handle it carefully. Trim what needed trimming, use the rest with the right treatment. There were dried onions in a sack behind the door, shriveled but not gone, a tin of lard 2/3 full, some dried herbs in small bundles hanging from a nail. She lifted each one and smelled it, setting aside what still held potency. A jug of molasses, sticky around the rim, but usable. A small sack of cornmeal pushed behind a crate, as if someone had forgotten it was there. She stood in the middle of the cookhouse for a moment with her hands at her sides and her eyes moving from shelf to shelf, taking a kind of inventory that was less a list and more a conversation, asking what each thing could still do, what it could become, what it could contribute to if treated correctly. Then she took off her coat, hung it on the nail that wasn't holding herbs, rolled up her sleeves, and went to work. She started the salt pork first, because it needed the most time and the most attention. She cut away what couldn't be saved, rinsed the rest more thoroughly than would have seemed necessary to someone watching, then put it to render low and slow in the largest pot she could find. Low heat. Patience. The fat needed to come out gradually, and the meat needed to relinquish the salt it had been curing in, or the whole dish would be ruined by it. While that worked, she mixed the cornmeal with lard and the last of what water was left in the cookhouse jug, working it by hand in a bowl that had seen better decades, feeling the texture until it told her what it needed. More lard, just a little. She added it without measuring, because she had never needed to measure, a fact she had always known about herself without particularly thinking about it. The dried beans she cracked open an approach her father had taught her for exactly this kind of time constraint, a rapid soak method that required more watching but compressed hours into 40 minutes if you kept the temperature right and didn't let the water boil too hard. She moved between the fire, the pots, the work table with a quietness that wasn't slowness. She was not a woman who narrated her work or made performance of it. She cooked the way other people breathed, continuously, without having to think about each individual motion. Outside, she could hear voices. The men were still in the yard, she knew. Some of them would be watching through the window. She'd seen one face disappear from the glass when she glanced up the first time, which told her they weren't watching from indifference. They were watching because they wanted to see her fail, or because something had made them uncertain that she would. An uncertainty about the thing you expected to be simple was its own uncomfortable experience. Let them watch. The onions went into the pork fat once enough had rendered out, and the sound they made hitting the hot lard, that specific violent sizzle that meant the heat was exactly right, cut through the cookhouse and drifted through the open window and out across the yard. She heard a voice outside say something she couldn't make out, and then a different kind of quiet followed it. The quality of silence outside the window changed. It went from the silence of people waiting for disappointment to something more complicated. She didn't let herself feel anything about that yet. The molasses she added to the beans while they were finishing their soak. Not much, just enough to pull the bitterness out and build the beginning of something underneath the beans' earthiness. Her father had shown her that trick on a winter night when they'd had nothing worth feeding to the 6 stranded travelers who'd made it to the way station in a snowstorm. He'd stood at the pot with a ladle and said, quiet and matter-of-fact, "You work with what the day gave you. You don't mourn what it didn't." She had been 19 years old and had not entirely believed him yet. She believed him now. The cornbread went into the Dutch oven with the last of the coals pulled to the edges, and she set it with the careful attention of someone who understood that the last 20 minutes of any difficult thing required the most concentration, not the least. Grady came to the door of the cookhouse once during all of this. He didn't come inside. He stood in the frame and looked at her, and she was aware of his presence without turning around. "Supper's usually at 6, he said. "I know what time supper is," she said. A long pause. She could feel him trying to decide how to respond to that, whether to escalate or retreat. He retreated, which told her something useful about him. He was the kind of man who picked his battles according to audience size. When there was no one watching, he was less brave. She filed that away. At 10 minutes to 6, she began plating. 20 men meant the food had to come out in sequence, kept hot in the pots until called for, served in the right order. She had no one to help her, which meant she would have to move fast once the men started coming through. She arranged what she had, the pork and onion mixture ladled over the beans, the cornbread cut and stacked in the center of the table, a thin gravy she'd pulled from the last of the drippings poured into a tin pitcher for those who wanted it. It wasn't a feast, she wasn't going to pretend it was, but it was food made with attention, which was a different thing entirely from food made by obligation or grudging rotation. Attention was an ingredient, her father had always said. You could taste the absence of it. She stepped to the cookhouse door and said, without ceremony, "Supper." The men came across the yard with the low-grade wariness of people who had been disappointed too many times to invest hope easily. They filed in. Grady came last, standing at the back with his arms crossed, watching, as if his presence were a form of evaluation rather than eating. The first man to take a bite was the young one from the fence post. She learned later his name was Pete, that he was 17 and had been on the ranch since April, and had eaten so much bad food in those months that he'd gone from a naturally enthusiastic eater to someone who approached meals with defensive pessimism. He took one bite, chewed, went very still in the specific way that people went still when something reached them that they hadn't expected to reach them. He took another bite. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Around the table, the silence deepened in a way that had nothing to do with discomfort and everything to do with concentration. Men eating in the specific way they ate when the food had their full attention, when chewing became a private experience rather than a social one. Someone at the end of the table said, very quietly, "Lord above." Someone else reached for a second piece of cornbread before he'd finished his first. Grady Tollins stood at the back of the room with his arms still crossed, and he ate what was put in front of him, and he said nothing. His face did not change, or it changed in ways too small for anyone to read clearly, but he ate every bite. Marin stood near the door with her own plate. She had made sure to take the smallest portion, the scraps that were left when everyone else had been served, because this was not a night when she could afford to be accused of feeding herself well at the crew's expense. She ate standing up, slowly, tasting what she'd made with the particular critical attention she always gave her own work. It wasn't her best. She knew exactly where she'd compensated for the flour's staleness and where she hadn't compensated enough. The beans could have used another 15 minutes, but she'd run out of time. The pork was good, that she was satisfied with. Good enough wasn't what she'd been aiming for. But it was enough. Callum Mercer sat at the head of the table and ate in silence, the way a man ate when he was thinking about something larger than supper. When he finished, he set down his fork with the particular deliberateness of a decision being made. He looked down the table. He looked at his crew, at men who had been grinding against each other for months, who had been eating bad food and working hard and losing ground in ways both visible and invisible, who were now, for this small window of this particular evening, sitting around a table without complaint, without hostility, with something on their faces that was close to, not happiness exactly, but ease, the temporary absence of grievance. He looked at Marin Holloway, standing by the door with her small plate. "The bed in the storeroom off the cookhouse," he said. "It hasn't been used, but it's there. I'll have someone clear it out tomorrow." Marin nodded once. Grady's head came up sharply. "Callum, the kitchen needs a cook, Grady." His voice was even. "We have one." Grady looked at Marin. Marin looked back at him steadily, without triumph or threat, just the plain acknowledgement of a woman who had said she would do something and had done it. He looked away first. Pete, the 17-year-old, was on his second helping. He would later tell people that it was the best meal he'd eaten since his mother's kitchen, which was the highest compliment he knew how to give. Marin set her empty plate down on the counter, quietly, and began clearing the table. She had earned one night. Tomorrow, she would have to earn another. She was up before anyone else the next morning. Not because someone told her to be. Not because she was trying to prove something, though she understood that everything she did in those first days would be read as proof of one thing or another. She was up because the cookhouse fire needed to be started by 4:30 if breakfast was going to be ready by 6, and she had counted 20 men the night before. And 20 men doing physical labor needed a real breakfast, not the burned coffee and cold biscuits she'd seen evidence of in the ash of yesterday's fire. The storeroom they'd cleared for her, Callum had sent Pete and another hand in that first evening to move the crates out, was small enough that she could touch both walls with her arms spread, and the cot left over from some previous use had a mattress that had seen too many seasons. She had slept on worse. She had slept on much worse, and the fact that there was a door she could close and a roof that didn't leak told her she was ahead of where she'd been the night before. She had lain awake for a while in the dark, not from anxiety, not exactly, but from the particular alertness that came when your circumstances changed faster than your body could process. Her mind kept running inventory, the flour situation, the bean supply, the salt pork that would be gone by end of week, the dried herbs she could stretch if she was careful, the question of what other supplies were coming and when. She was also running a different kind of inventory, one she couldn't have written down in any ledger. The men she'd served the night before, their faces, their postures, the small behaviors that told you what kind of crew you were dealing with. She had fed enough different kinds of men in her years at the way station to read a table the way some people read weather. Pete was easy, young, essentially kind, starving for something he couldn't quite name, which was probably just consistency. Two men at the far end of the table had eaten without looking up, which meant they were either exhausted or deeply interior people, and she hadn't decided which yet. There was a man in his 50s, gray-whiskered, who had nodded at her when he brought his plate back to the counter. Not a thank you exactly, more an acknowledgement of a job done correctly, the kind of nod a craftsman gave another craftsman's work. She had noted that. A man who noticed quality without being asked was someone worth knowing. And there was Grady. She was not going to underestimate Grady Tollins. That was the thing about men who threw things at your feet. The throwing was rarely the worst they could do. It was a signal, not an ending. The fire caught on the second try, and she had coffee going within 15 minutes, which she knew from experience would be the first thing anyone noticed, and the fastest way to establish that the cookhouse was, once again, a place that functioned. She was working on a cornmeal porridge, thin on flavor alone but workable with the molasses she'd rationed carefully the night before, when she heard the door. It was Pete. He stood in the doorway in the half-dark with his hat already on, and his boots still unlaced, and he looked at the fire going and the coffee pot on the stove, and something in his young face shifted in a way that was almost hard to watch. "You're already up," he said, as if this were a minor miracle he needed to record. "Coffee's 10 minutes out," she said. He came in and sat down on the stool near the work table, not asking permission, not announcing himself, just occupying the space with the ease of someone who was used to making himself small enough to be tolerated. He watched her work for a while without speaking, which she appreciated. People who narrated what they were watching while you worked were a specific kind of exhausting. After a while, he said, "Grady's going to make it hard for you." She kept stirring. "I know. He's been foreman here 3 years. Acts like that means something permanent. Most men in his position do." Pete was quiet again, then, "Last cook left because of him. The one before that too, I think, but I wasn't here for that one." She didn't say anything to that, and he seemed to understand that she wasn't inviting more detail. What she was doing, and what he was perhaps too young to recognize, was filing the information away without showing that she was. It mattered. It told her the pattern was established and deliberate, not occasional. "Laces," she said without looking down. "What?" "Your boots. Tie them before the others get here. You trip in this kitchen while I've got a fire going, we've both got a problem." He looked down at his feet, then back up at her with an expression that was somewhere between surprised and grateful, and he bent and tied them. The rest of the crew came in over the next 40 minutes in the slow, sequential way of men adjusting to a new order of things. The coffee was ready, the porridge was ready. It wasn't remarkable food. She knew that, and she thought they knew it too. But it was hot, and it was there, and it was consistent, which after months of rotating disasters was its own form of extraordinary. Nobody said much. Ranch hands in the early morning rarely did, But nobody complained either, which in this specific context she read as progress. Grady came in last. He poured his own coffee without looking at her, sat at the end of the table that had become, she already understood, his established territory, and ate in the pointed silence of a man performing indifference. When he finished, he stood, set his cup down harder than necessary on the counter, not quite slamming it, maintaining the thin excuse of accident, and walked out. The gray-whiskered man watched him go. Then he looked at Marin. "Name's Walt," he said. "Been here 6 years." He said it like those were the only facts that mattered, and picked up his hat and left. She would figure out later that Walt Briggs was the closest thing the crew had to a second conscience. A man who said little, but whose silence had weight, whose approval or disapproval could shift the mood of a room without him lifting a finger to direct it. In the economy of the ranch's social world, Walt's 6 quiet words to her that morning were worth considerably more than they appeared. The first real test came 3 days in. She had found a rhythm by then. Nothing elegant, nothing without friction, but a working rhythm. Breakfast, then the preparation for midday, then the longer preparation for supper. She had taken stock of the full supply situation by the second morning, sent Pete, who seemed to have appointed himself her unofficial assistant without anyone agreeing to this arrangement, to check the root cellar and the dry storage shed for anything she might have missed. He'd come back with a partial sack of dried apples, some salt she hadn't known was there, and a wheel of hard cheese wrapped in cloth that was still, somehow, good. She had looked at that cheese for a moment the way you looked at unexpected fortune, with gratitude and without sentiment. The supply wagon was due on Friday, Callum had told her on the second morning. He'd stopped at the cookhouse door on his way to the barn, early, when she was the only one there. He didn't come inside, just stood in the doorway with his coffee. She'd handed it to him without asking, because he was there and it was ready, and told her what the regular supply situation looked like. Salt, flour, canned goods from the trading post in Millard Creek, occasional fresh meat when the slaughter schedule aligned. He was methodical about it, specific in the way she appreciated, giving her information rather than instruction. "What do you need that we don't have?" he asked. She had a list. She'd written it the night before on the back of a piece of feed sack paper she'd found in the storeroom. She handed it to him. He read it without comment, folded it, and put it in his shirt pocket. "I'll see what I can do," he said. "The vinegar is most important," she said. "For preservation, the summer's not over and we need to start putting things up now if we're going to have enough variety in the fall." He looked at her for a moment. "I hadn't thought about fall yet." "I know," she said, and didn't make anything of it. He nodded, something specific in the nod that she read as the beginning of trust, not the arrival of it, and went to the barn. The test on the third day came in the form of a man named Decker. Decker was the largest man on the crew, somewhere north of 6 feet, and built in the way of men who had spent their entire adult lives doing work that required their bodies to be instruments of force. He had not spoken to her at all in the first 2 days. Not rudely, not bluntly, simply not spoken, as if she occupied a category of existence he hadn't yet decided how to classify. He came to the cookhouse at midday alone, which was unusual. The rest of the crew was still at the east pasture. She heard later that he'd taken a bad step coming off a fence and twisted his ankle enough to be sent back, which he had apparently received with deep personal offense. He came into the cookhouse and sat down, and she set a plate in front of him, beans again, because it was still midweek and the supply wagon hadn't arrived. And he looked at it. "Beans again," he said. "Yes," she said. "Had beans 4 times this week." 3 times, she said. Tuesday was twice in one day, but that was the same day. He looked up at her. She wasn't sure if he was deciding to be angry or deciding not to be. His ankle was clearly hurting. He'd come in without putting full weight on it, and pain made men unpredictable in ways that hunger didn't. "I hate beans," he said. "I know," she said. "Most people do by the time they've eaten them out of necessity for long enough. The supply wagon comes Friday. I've asked for more variety." "You asked." He said it flatly, like he was deciding what to do with the information. "Sit down properly," she said. "You're listing to the left to keep weight off that ankle, and you're going to make it worse." He stared at her. She met it evenly. He shifted his weight and sat squarely. There's nothing else right now, she said. I'm sorry about that. What I can tell you is that the beans tonight will taste different from the beans today because I found dried apples, and I'm doing something with pork and apple that will make you forget it started as beans. She paused. Probably. The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the preliminary motion of a smile in a face that had forgotten the practice. Probably, he repeated. I'm not going to promise you things I don't know yet, she said, but I'm trying. He ate the beans. He didn't say they were good, but he finished them and he took the second portion she offered without being asked twice, which was its own kind of answer. She spent the rest of that afternoon doing something she had been planning since the first morning, a full, serious reorganization of the cookhouse. Not decorative, functional. The flour moved away from the east wall to a cooler corner. The dry goods rearranged so that oldest stocks were in front, newest behind. She found a tin container with a lid that fit well enough and transferred the cornmeal into it from the open sack where it was slowly accumulating moisture. She scrubbed the work table down with water and the last of what vinegar she had. Not enough. She needed more. And evaluated the condition of every pot and pan hanging from the crossbeam. 2 of the pots had handles that were close to failing. She noted them for Callum. Pete came in around 3 to find her elbow deep in reorganizing the cabinet under the work table, which apparently had been used as general storage for items that defied other categorization. A broken harness buckle, 3 mismatched spoons, a tin cup with no handle, a book of some kind that had gotten wet and dried in a warped permanent curl. What is that? She asked, holding up the book. Pete looked at it. Oh, I think that was the old cook's. He scratched the back of his neck. He used to read it when things were slow. I don't know what it is. She turned it over. The cover was too damaged to read clearly. She set it on the shelf. Not her business. I need you to help me carry the flour barrel to that corner, she said. Grady's going to say you're moving things around without permission, Pete said, but he was already crossing the room to take one side of the barrel. Grady doesn't run the cookhouse, she said. He thinks he does. A lot of men think they run things they don't run, she said. Help me lift on 3. They moved the barrel. Pete's face went red with the effort, and he dropped his side slightly early, which meant the landing was harder than ideal and sent a small cloud of flour dust into the air between them. He started to apologize. She waved it off. Good enough, she said. Go wash your hands before you touch anything else. The supply wagon on Friday came with most of what she'd asked for, and 2 things she hadn't. The vinegar was there. The extra variety of canned goods was there. What she hadn't asked for but found at the bottom of the second crate was a small bundle of fresh herbs, thyme, rosemary, wrapped in damp cloth, and a half-dozen eggs packed in sawdust, slightly miraculous in their survival of the journey. She stood there with the eggs in her hands and felt something she was careful not to show. Callum was standing nearby, watching her unpack. The woman at the trading post threw in the herbs, he said, when she heard we'd hired a proper cook. I don't know where the eggs came from. I think she added those too. Marin looked up at him. Tell her thank you. You can tell her yourself when you go to town. She went back to unpacking. I don't know when I'd go to town. You'll need to eventually, for your own things, if nothing else. She didn't answer that. The idea of her own things that weren't borrowed or scrounged or carried in a satchel for 4 days across frontier land, felt distant in a way she couldn't quite examine. That Friday supper was the first meal at Redstone that felt like something other than maintenance. She made a proper stew with the fresh pork Callum had arranged from a neighboring ranch. A trade of some kind. She didn't ask the details. The herbs went in at the right moment. She used the eggs for a cornbread that was better than her first attempt. Richer, with a crust that held when you pressed it. She made a gravy from the stew drippings that she reduced until it was serious. The kind of gravy you put on everything because it improved everything. The crew came in and sat down, and the difference in the room was immediate. It wasn't loud. It wasn't festive. But the quality of the silence changed. It became the silence of people who were receiving something, not just consuming it. Men who had been eating in the routine, defensive way of people who no longer expected pleasure from food, were suddenly, visibly recalibrating. Walt, the gray-whiskered hand, looked up from his plate, at the midpoint of the meal, and said, to no one in particular, "This is a stew." It was such a simple observation that several men laughed, and then were surprised by themselves laughing, and then laughed again at the surprise. Marin heard it from the cookhouse and allowed herself privately a single moment of something like satisfaction. Not pride. Pride felt like it belonged to a different kind of moment. This was smaller and more specific, the feeling of having executed something difficult and having executed it correctly. Then she heard Grady's voice from the dining room, not loud but carrying. "Anybody could do this with fresh stock," he said. "We had bad supplies before. That's all this is." A pause. The kind of pause that meant people were deciding whether to agree or disagree out loud. Walt said, quiet as ever, "Bad supplies were there before too. Didn't taste like this." Silence. Grady didn't respond to that. Marin heard the scrape of his chair. He was done, leaving early, and his boots on the floor and the door. She was clearing the work table when Callum came to the cookhouse at the end of the meal. He did that now, she'd noticed. Came by after supper to return his own plate, which none of the other men did. She hadn't decided yet what it meant, if it meant anything. "Crew's been different this week," he said. "Different how?" "Less arguing. Less of the low-grade grinding that goes on when men are unhappy." He set his plate down. "I know that sounds like I'm crediting you with too much." "You might be," she said honestly. "Maybe." He looked at the reorganized shelves, the clean work table, the carefully stacked supplies. "Or maybe not." He turned to go, then stopped. "Grady's going to keep testing you." "I know. He's—" Callum paused in the way of someone choosing words with more care than usual. "He's been here a long time. He's good at his job, with the cattle, with the men in the field. He's not—" Another pause. "He doesn't adjust easily to things changing." "Most people don't," she said, without any particular edge to it. Callum looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "They don't." He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the counter. "You cooked well tonight." "The herbs made the difference," she said. "Tell the woman at the trading post." He almost smiled. She wasn't entirely sure. It happened fast and then it was gone. But she thought he almost did. He left. She banked the fire and washed the last of the pots, and in the quiet of the cookhouse, with the night coming down outside, and the sounds of the ranch settling into itself, she let herself think for the first time in a week without the pressing urgency of immediate problems. She had a bed. She had a fire. She had supplies, and a working kitchen, and a crew that was, cautiously, beginning to believe in the possibility of being fed well. She had Grady Tollins, who was going to look for the first mistake she made and use it with both hands. She had Callum Mercer, who was watching in the careful way of a man who had been burned before and did not intend to be burned again, and who had nonetheless, in small specific ways, started to trust her. She had Pete, who was 17 and lacing his boots properly now, and who had started lingering in the cookhouse doorway in the early mornings, even when he had no particular reason to be there. She had Walt's nod. She had Decker's second portion of beans on an afternoon when he'd come in, hurting and angry, and she hadn't apologized for the beans, but had promised something better and had delivered it. She was thinking about all of this when she heard it, a sound from the yard that was wrong in a way she couldn't immediately place, a low, irregular sound. She set down the pot she was drying and went to the cookhouse door and opened it. A man was sitting against the outside wall of the bunkhouse, hunched forward with his arms around his knees. Not one of the regular crew. She'd counted 20 and knew their shapes by now. This man was older and dressed in clothes that were, if possible, worse than hers had been when she arrived. He was sitting very still in the way of people who have run out of the energy required to do anything else. She looked at him for a moment in the near dark. She looked back at the cookhouse, at the banked fire, at the pot she'd been putting away. She thought about what Callum had said. She could do it his way, keep her head down, avoid anything that might give Grady a reason to come after her. She thought about a way station in winter and 6 stranded travelers and her father standing at the pot with a ladle. She went back inside and rebuilt the fire. She found what was left from supper, enough if she stretched it, and heated it and put it in a tin cup with a spoon and carried it outside. The man looked up when she crouched in front of him. His eyes were the specific vacancy of someone who had been going without for a while. Not mentally absent, just conserving, running on the minimum. She handed him the cup without saying anything. He took it with hands that shook slightly, and he ate the way people ate when they had stopped trusting that food was something that kept appearing, all at once, focused completely, as if each bite might be retracted. She sat on the ground nearby and let him eat without watching him too closely, which was its own kind of courtesy. When he was done, he held the cup in both hands and said, "Thank you." "There's water in the pump around the east side," she said. "Use it before you go." She didn't offer more than that. She couldn't, not without permission she hadn't asked for and might not get. But she held the cup back inside and she stood in the cookhouse doorway and watched until she saw him move toward the pump in the dark, slow but upright, still going. She didn't know his name. She never learned it. But she thought about the moment later and the decision inside it, the decision that had nothing to do with strategy or earning trust or proving herself to a yard full of laughing men. Some things were just what you did because the other option was not doing them, and that wasn't something she could live inside. She banked the fire again and went to bed. Outside, the Wyoming night pressed down on Redstone Ranch, cool and enormous, carrying the sounds of cattle settling and the creak of the barn door in the wind and the particular silence of 20 men in the bunkhouse finally sleeping without the background noise of their own collective dissatisfaction. It was the end of her first week. She had earned 6 days. Tomorrow she would have to earn another. And somewhere in the dark of the foreman's room, Grady Tollins lay awake, staring at the ceiling, turning something over and over in his mind that he couldn't quite name yet, but that felt in the irritating, undeniable way of true things like guilt. The second week was harder than the first. That was the thing nobody told you about earning your place somewhere. The first week ran on adrenaline and the novelty of the situation and the pure animal focus of survival. The second week was where the real work started, because the novelty had worn off for everyone, including her, and what remained was just the daily grind of it, stripped of drama. The supply situation improved marginally after Friday's wagon, but marginally was doing a lot of work in that sentence. She had more to work with than she'd had at the start, but 20 men doing hard physical labor through the tail end of summer required a volume of food that kept her in a constant low-grade state of calculation. Every meal was a math problem with variables she couldn't always control. The days when extra hands came through to help with fence repair, which meant mouths she hadn't counted on. The days when the heat killed everyone's appetite until late afternoon and the food she'd prepared at the right time sat and lost quality. The mornings when Pete came in to tell her something in the dry store had shifted or spilled, or, on one particularly dispiriting Wednesday, that something had gotten into the cornmeal overnight. She stood over the ruined cornmeal sack and looked at it for a long moment. "Mouse," Pete said unnecessarily. The evidence was clear. "I can see that," she said. "I'm sorry, I should have checked the—" "It's not your fault," she said. "Find me something to seal the new sack with. Check the barn for tin containers, anything with a lid that closes properly." He went. She scooped out the compromised portion and examined what was left, calculating what she could still use and what had to go. It was a smaller loss than it felt in the moment. She reminded herself of that deliberately, because the temptation in bad moments was to catastrophize, to let one ruined sack become the symbol of everything uncertain, and she had never had the luxury of that particular indulgence. She rebuilt the meal around what she had. It was not her best work that Wednesday. The crew ate without complaint, which she was beginning to understand was its own complicated form of feedback. Silence meaning adequate, not excellent. She held herself to a higher standard than adequate, and the gap between what she'd planned and what she'd produced sat with her through the cleanup and into the early dark. Grady noticed. She knew he noticed because he said nothing, specifically, deliberately nothing, which was louder than any comment he could have made. He ate, set down his fork, and looked at her for just a moment too long before he left the table. It was the look of a man banking something, storing it for later use. She let him have the moment. She had no energy to spend on managing his satisfaction. What she spent her energy on instead was Pete. It had happened gradually, without her planning it. He was always there in the margins of her work, carrying things, fetching things, asking questions that started practical and sometimes went somewhere more interesting. He had a quick mind that he didn't fully trust yet, which was the specific condition of 17 in someone who'd been underestimated by enough adults to have started doing it to himself. She had started, without announcing it, teaching him things. Not formally, not sitting down and saying, "Here is a lesson." Just the running commentary of working alongside someone, explaining why she was doing what she was doing while she was doing it, which kept her own thinking sharp and gave him something to hold on to. "Why do you add salt at the end?" he asked one morning, watching her finish a pot of porridge. "Because salt draws moisture out as it cooks. If you add it too early to something that needs to stay soft, you work against yourself." She handed him the spoon. "Taste it before and after." He tasted it. His face went through 3 expressions in quick succession: baseline expectation, surprise at the before, then the after, and he looked at the spoon as if it had done something unexpected. "It's the same ingredients," he said. "Timing is an ingredient," she said. "Remember that." He did. She noticed he started tasting things at different stages when he helped her, which was more than most grown men did without being told twice. By the end of the second week, he could make a passable cornbread without supervision. It wasn't good yet. He had a habit of overmixing that gave it a tough crumb, but it was passable. And passable was a foundation. She didn't tell him it was passable. She told him where he went wrong, specifically with enough detail that he could correct it. She had seen enough people learn by being only encouraged, with nothing to aim at, to know that vague praise was nearly as useless as no instruction at all. Pete took the corrections without sulking, which told her something important about him. The situation with Grady came to its first real head on a Tuesday morning in September, when the air had begun carrying the first thin edge of autumn and the crew's mood had lifted slightly with the drop in temperature. She had been at Redstone 5 weeks by then, long enough that her presence had shifted from provisional to something closer to expected, though nobody had said so explicitly. Long enough that she had learned the rhythms of the place, which men ate fast and which ate slow, which ones came back for seconds without being offered and which needed to be offered before they'd ask, which ones were carrying injuries they hadn't reported because reporting injuries meant being taken off work, and being taken off work meant falling behind in pay. She noticed these things the way her father had taught her to notice the travelers who came through the way station, reading hunger not just as a physical state, but as a condition with history and context. The man who ate too fast hadn't always had enough. The man who ate carefully and methodically had learned to make things last. She had started, quietly, putting slightly larger portions in front of the men she'd identified as struggling without making it visible enough to embarrass them. It required calibration, enough to matter, not so much that anyone noticed. This was a skill she had developed over years, and it required constant adjustment because people changed. Decker's ankle had healed and he was back at full capacity, which she marked by the return of his appetite to its previous formidable levels. He had not mentioned the beans conversation again. Neither had she. But there was something different in the way he positioned himself at the table now, less deliberately apart from things, more occupied by the room. It was a small change. She thought she was probably the only one who noticed. The Tuesday morning confrontation started with flour. She had submitted her supply list for the week's wagon on Monday, as she'd established as the routine with Callum. The list was specific, prioritized, written in the clear hand she'd developed from years of keeping records at the way station. At the top, 50 pounds of flour, because she was down to the last barrel and a half, and the weeks ahead were going to require more baking as the temperatures dropped and the men's caloric needs increased. She came into the cookhouse that Tuesday morning and found the dry goods from the wagon stacked inside the door by whoever had unloaded it before dawn. She went through the crates methodically. The flour was not there. She went through them again. 30 pounds of dried beans she hadn't ordered in those quantities. A second crate of salt she didn't need yet. No flour. She stood in the cookhouse and breathed for a moment. Then she went and found Callum, who was at the barn with 2 other men looking at a horse that was favoring its left front leg. "The flour wasn't on the wagon," she said. He turned, read her face. "I ordered it." "I know you did. It wasn't there." She paused. Someone changed the order. He went still in the specific way of a man who already knows the shape of a problem before it's fully named. "I'll look into it," he said. "I need to know by noon," she said, "because if I don't have flour by noon, supper tonight is a different conversation." "I understand." She went back to the cookhouse. She spent the next hour doing what she always did when something went wrong. She inventoried what she actually had, not what she'd planned to have, and she rebuilt the day's meals from there. It was solvable. It was annoying, and it was solvable. Beans and salt pork again, which the crew was going to receive with exactly the enthusiasm she anticipated, but solvable. What was not solvable by cookhouse logic alone was the question of who had changed the order and why. She already knew the answer to the first half of that question. Grady Tollins had been on the porch of the main house the previous afternoon when the supply driver stopped to review the order. She had seen it from the cookhouse window without paying particular attention. Grady talked to everyone who came through. It was part of how he maintained his position as the intermediary between the ranch and the outside world. She had not thought about it then. She thought about it now. Callum came to the cookhouse at 11:30. He stood in the doorway with a specific quality of controlled anger that she had not seen from him before. Contained, precise, the kind that was more dangerous than the kind that shouted. "The order was modified at the gate," he said. "I know," she said. Grady told the driver the flour request was an error, said 30 pounds of beans were needed instead. He paused. The driver didn't question it because Grady's been the one managing supply orders for 3 years. She kept working. She was salting the pork, paying attention to the pressure she used, the distribution. What did Grady say when you asked him? That he was correcting what he considered a waste of money, that we had enough flour. We did not have enough flour. I know that. She looked up at him. What are you going to do? It was a direct question and she asked it directly, which she understood was a risk. She was new here and he was the owner, and this was in the end his decision. But she needed to know because the answer told her what her actual position here was, underneath the bed in the storeroom and the daily meals and the small, quiet progress of the last 5 weeks. Callum looked at her for a moment. I'm going to tell him that supply orders go through you to me and that no one modifies them at the gate, that this is not a discussion. She held his gaze. And if he does it again? Then we'll have a different conversation. He said it with the finality of a man who had made a decision he wasn't going to revisit. I'm having flour brought from Millard Creek this afternoon. It'll cost twice what it should. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't mean to create... You didn't create anything, he said. Quiet, clear. This was created for you. He picked up his hat. I should have addressed Grady's behavior the first morning. I didn't because I thought he'd adjust on his own. That was my error. He left. She stood in the cookhouse with the unsettling feeling of having been defended, which was not a feeling she had a well-worn groove for, and went back to the pork. The flour arrived at 3:30. She had enough time. She made biscuits that night, which she had not made since her first week because biscuits required flour she couldn't afford to spare. She made them plain, nothing complicated. The good flour deserved to speak for itself without being buried under additions. And she put them on the table in a cloth-lined basket the way her mother had, keeping them warm. When Pete came in and saw the basket, he stopped walking in the middle of the room. Are those... He started. Sit down, Pete. He sat down. He reached for one before anyone else was at the table, and she let him, because he was 17 and he'd carried things and asked good questions and corrected his overmixing habit after she'd told him only once. The biscuit dissolved the way good biscuits did, layered, yielding, the kind of texture that required both the right proportions and the right handling of the dough, not overworked. Not underworked. Pete closed his eyes for a moment in an expression of such uncomplicated pleasure that Walt, sitting down across from him, made a sound that might have been a laugh. Good? Walt asked. Devastating, Pete said, and reached for another. Grady came in and looked at the basket. His face did not change. He sat down. He took a biscuit. He ate it in the particular way of a man refusing to acknowledge that what he was eating was good, which required more effort than simply eating it. Nobody mentioned the flour. Nobody mentioned the morning's situation. The room had the specific quality of people who knew something had happened and were choosing to let it settle. After supper, as the men filtered out, Marin was clearing when Walt paused beside her at the counter. He set his plate down and stood there a moment, looking at the basket of remaining biscuits. Woman who used to cook for us when I was young, he said, not looking at her, made biscuits like that. My grandmother. He picked up his hat from the counter where he'd left it. Thought you should know. He walked out. She stood very still for a moment after he left. Then she picked up his plate and washed it. The week after the flour incident, something shifted in the architecture of the ranch's social world that was small enough to miss if you weren't paying attention, and large enough to matter if you were. The men started coming to the cookhouse, not for meals, for the time between meals. Pete had always been there, but now others drifted in, separately and without apparent coordination, as if they'd each independently discovered that the cookhouse was a place where the specific misery of the bunkhouse, 12 men's worth of accumulated noise and grievance and bad smells, did not exist. She did not invite them, and she did not turn them away. She gave them something to do if they were going to stand around. Hold this, pass me that, tell me if this smells right to you. And they did it without complaint, which was unusual in her experience of men who were not being paid to do what you asked. Decker came one afternoon and sat on the stool and said nothing for 20 minutes, just watched her work. Then he said, "My wife used to make something that smelled like what you've got going there." She didn't look up. "What did she make?" "Something with onions and pork. I don't know what you call it." He was quiet for a moment. "She passed 4 years ago. Fever." "I'm sorry," she said. She meant it without performance. He was quiet again. "You don't have to. I'm not saying that for—" He stopped, frustrated with his own sentence. "I know," she said. "You're saying it because it's there. That's fine." He sat for another few minutes, and then he left, and she didn't make anything of it, didn't mention it to anyone, treated it as the private confidence it had been offered as. That was the week she understood that the cookhouse was becoming something she hadn't consciously designed but had apparently created through the accumulation of small decisions. A place where people could set down whatever they were carrying outside, even briefly. Not comfortable exactly, not soft. It was still a working kitchen that was hot and demanding and required you to stay out of the way, but something. She was not naive about what that something was. She had seen it at the way station too. The way a place where food was made honestly and people were treated without condescension became over time a kind of gravity. People were pulled toward it for reasons they couldn't always articulate. The challenge was that gravity worked on everyone, including people you would rather it didn't. She first noticed the boy watching from outside the fence on a Thursday afternoon in late September. He wasn't one of the ranch hands. He was young, younger than Pete by several years, 12 at most, she thought. And he was standing at the fence line near the east side of the cookhouse with the specific stillness of a child who has learned to be invisible to adults. He was there when she went out to the pump for water. He was gone when she came back. He was there again the next morning in approximately the same spot. She told Pete about him on the second day. Pete knew who he was immediately. "That's Tommy Eld," he said. "His family has the small claim about 2 miles east. His father—" Pete's face went through something complicated. "His father drinks. The mother does what she can. There are 4 kids." She looked out toward the fence line. The boy wasn't there right now. "Does he come to the ranch often?" she asked. "Started coming around last month," Pete said. "Grady ran him off twice. Told him we don't feed strays." The words sat between them in the air. She went back to what she was doing. Pete watched her face and didn't ask what she was thinking, which was the right choice on his part. The following afternoon, she put a plate together. Not scraps. A proper small plate, the same quality as what she served the crew. She carried it out to the fence line and set it on the top rail of the fence and went back inside without saying anything, without looking around, without making the gesture into an event. 20 minutes later, the plate was empty. She retrieved it without ceremony. She did this for 3 days before the boy spoke to her. He appeared at the back door of the cookhouse on a Sunday morning when the crew was at the barn doing weekly maintenance work. He knocked on the door frame, a small, precise knock, the knock of a child who'd been taught that you asked before you entered. She looked at him. He was thin in the specific way of children who were not getting enough, the kind of thin that didn't show on the face yet, but showed in the way they held their shoulders, drawn in slightly as if making themselves smaller reduced the space they took up. "I wanted to say thank you," he said. "For the plate." "You're welcome," she said. "Come in out of the sun." He came in and stood just inside the door, looking around the cookhouse with the wide, comprehensive attention of a child who is memorizing things. His eyes went to the fire, the pots, the shelves, the work table, in a sweep that was almost professional. "You cook for all of them?" he said. 20 men, she said. "Sit down if you want." He sat on Pete's stool. She gave him a biscuit. She had a batch from this morning's breakfast that were still warm, and he ate it in that careful way, making it last. And she understood what Pete had told her about the family without needing any further detail. "Do you like to cook?" she asked. He looked at her as if the question were unexpectedly interesting. I don't know, he said. I make things sometimes, at home, when Mama's too tired. What do you make? Mostly cornmeal. Sometimes I fry things. He ate the last of the biscuit. I burned the cornmeal once, and my father... He stopped. She didn't pursue the end of the sentence. Burning cornmeal is easy, she said. The fix is easy too. Lower heat than you think, and you have to keep moving it. Sitting still is what burns it. He looked at her with the expression of someone receiving information they immediately recognized as useful. She gave him another biscuit and told him about the heat. She told him about the importance of keeping things moving. She told him 3 things, not 10, not 20, just 3, because 3 things could be remembered and applied, and 10 things became noise. He listened with the concentrated attention of a child who had learned that some opportunities didn't repeat. When he left, he said thank you again at the door, formal and sincere in the way children were when they'd been raised by a mother who insisted on manners despite everything else. She watched him walk back toward the fence line. Grady saw him from across the yard. She watched it happen, watched Grady clock the boy, watched his face do the thing it did when he identified something he could address, the particular setting of the jaw that preceded action. He crossed the yard toward the boy. She could not hear what he said from the cookhouse door, but she watched Tommy Eld's shoulders come up and his chin go down, and she watched him walk faster toward the fence, not quite running but moving with the urgency of someone who had been told to leave in a way that did not invite discussion. Grady turned back toward the ranch buildings. He saw her standing in the cookhouse doorway. They looked at each other across the distance of the yard. She said nothing. He said nothing. He turned and walked toward the barn. She went back inside and picked up the bowl she'd been working with and stood at the work table. And for the first time in 5 weeks, she felt something that was close to anger. Not the hot kind, but the cold, considered kind that settled in around a situation and made it clear that something needed to be decided. She had been careful. She had been patient. She had worked within the lines of what she understood to be her position here. The cook, with a borrowed storeroom and a provisional place in the order of things. She had not pushed at Grady's authority in the yard, had not contradicted him in front of the crew, had operated in the space she was given and expanded it only by the daily quality of her work. But she had fed a hungry child 3 days in a row from the ranch's supplies, without asking permission, and Grady had just run that child off the property in front of her. She had a decision to make. She made it that evening. Callum came to return his plate after supper, as had become routine. She set down the pot she was washing. "The Eld boy," she said. "He's been coming by." Callum looked at her steadily. "I've seen him. I've been feeding him." "I know." He said it without inflection. Not approval, not disapproval, just acknowledgement. "Grady ran him off this afternoon," she said. Callum set his plate on the counter. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who hadn't heard, but the quiet of someone organizing their thoughts carefully. "How often has he been coming?" "Every day this week. He told me his mother's struggling. 4 children." "The Elds have had a hard year," Callum said. "Most people around here have, but—" He stopped. "But," she said. He looked at her. "It's ranch food. The men paid for work." "I'm not taking from the men's portions," she said. "I built the extra into the preparation. He's eating what would otherwise be thrown out or banked." This was true. It was also true that she had deliberately planned slightly more than needed each day for the past week, specifically so that this would be true. She didn't mention the planning. The outcome was the same. Callum looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't fully read him. He was a man who kept his deliberations mostly interior, which she respected even when it made him difficult to navigate. "The boy can come to the back door," he said finally. "Not the front, not in the way of the crew's work." She nodded once. "Grady won't like it," he said. "Grady doesn't like most things," she said. Something moved in Callum's face. It wasn't quite the almost smile she'd seen before, but it was adjacent to it. He picked up his hat. "No," he said. "He doesn't." He left. She finished washing the pot. She was settling into the storeroom that night when she heard voices outside. Callum's and Grady's, in the space between the main house and the bunkhouse. She was not trying to hear them, but the walls of the storeroom were not substantial, and the night was quiet. She heard her name. She heard Grady's voice, the specific register of a man making a controlled argument, keeping the anger technical. She couldn't make out every word, but she caught enough. Undermining. Doesn't know how this place works. Charity case herself. She heard Callum's voice, shorter, less audible. Then Grady, louder. You're letting her change everything. Callum's response, she heard this clearly, because he said it more sharply than he'd been speaking, was, some things needed changing. Silence. Then footsteps going in different directions. She lay on her cot in the dark and stared at the ceiling of the storeroom and thought about Grady Tollins, who was a man in pain about something she didn't yet fully understand. Not just her presence, not just the disruption of the cookhouse, but something older than her arrival that her arrival had apparently aggravated. She thought about the ladle in the dirt on the first afternoon. She thought about the way he had looked at the boy walking fast toward the fence. She thought about the fact that men who were angry in that particular way, cold and systematic, and always looking for the edge to press on, were usually angry because something inside them needed addressing that they didn't know how to address. This did not make him easier to deal with. It did not make him less of a problem. But it made him, against her preference, someone she would have to try to understand before this was over. She turned on her side and closed her eyes. Outside, the first real edge of autumn moved through the Wyoming night, carrying the smell of the coming cold. And somewhere 2 miles east, in a small homestead claim that was doing its best to hold together, a 12-year-old boy was probably asleep with a full stomach for the third night in a row. She held on to that and let the rest of it wait until morning. October arrived at Redstone Ranch the way hard seasons always did. Not all at once, but in increments that accumulated faster than you expected, until one morning you stepped outside and the air had a different weight to it, and you understood that the easy part was behind you. Marin had been watching the signs for weeks. The way the light changed angle. The way the cattle moved differently in the late afternoon, pressing toward the south-facing slopes. The way the men came in from the fields with a different kind of tiredness. Not the heat-wrung exhaustion of summer, but something denser. The tiredness of bodies beginning to work harder just to stay warm. She had been preparing since August. Nobody knew the full extent of it. That was by design. She had learned at the way station that the difference between a place that survived hard seasons and a place that didn't had almost nothing to do with luck and almost everything to do with what was done in the weeks before anyone thought preparation was necessary. Her father had said it plainly, without poetry. The time to fix a roof is when the sun is shining, because when it's raining, you're already too late. She had started the preservation work in the last week of August, when the supply wagon began bringing in the late-season produce from the trading post. Cabbages, dried apples, root vegetables that would keep if stored correctly. She had requisitioned vinegar, salt, extra crocks, and a quantity of rendered lard that had made Callum raise an eyebrow when he reviewed the supply list. "That's a significant amount of lard," he said. "I'm sealing crocks," she said. "You layer lard over the top of preserved food, and it keeps the air out, keeps it longer." He looked at the list for another moment. How much longer? Through winter, if the storage stays cold and the seals hold. He approved the order without further comment. She had noticed that this was how Callum operated. He asked enough questions to understand what he was agreeing to, and then he agreed or he didn't, without the prolonged negotiation that some men use to remind you that they were the ones making the decision. It was an efficient quality, and she had come to rely on it. The root cellar became her project through September. It had been used as general storage for ranch equipment before she arrived. The kind of creeping disorganization that happened when no one person was responsible for a space. She had asked Callum's permission to reorganize it, received it, and spent 3 mornings pulling out the displaced equipment and returning it to the barn where it belonged. Pete helped and complained only moderately about the spiders. What she built in that root cellar over 6 weeks was not complicated. It was methodical. Crocks of preserved cabbage labeled with cloth strips she'd marked with charcoal. Dried beans in sealed containers. Cured pork packed in salt in the deep bins at the back where the temperature stayed most consistent. Dried apple rings on strings that she checked every few days for mold. A separate section for the root vegetables, bedded in dry sand the way her father had shown her. Not piled, but laid individually, not touching, because one rotting turnip could move through a pile and take the whole supply with it. She did not announce any of this to the crew. She did not make a point of it to Callum beyond the supply requests. She simply did it, day after day, in the time between the work that was visible and the night that was not. Grady knew something was happening in the root cellar. He had gone down there once in late September, and she had heard him on the stairs and had continued working without turning around, labeling a crock with the date and contents. He had stood behind her for a long moment. "You're using a lot of the ranch's supplies for," he started. "Storage," she said. "Preservation. The supply list was approved." "I know it was approved." She turned and looked at him then, because she had learned by now that there were moments with Grady where looking at him directly was the only language he registered clearly. "Is there a concern you want to bring to Callum?" A pause. The specific kind that meant he was deciding whether the battle was worth it at this particular moment. "Just keeping track," he said. "That's your job," she said, without sarcasm, just statement of fact. She turned back to the crock. He went back up the stairs. She released a slow breath and kept working. By the time October's quality of light had fully replaced September's, she had put up enough stored food to feed the crew through approximately 14 weeks of supply disruption if the portions were managed carefully. She had not told anyone that number. It lived in her head, in the private accounting she kept that had no paper form. Just the knowledge, solid and specific, of what was in that cellar and what it could do. The first real test of October was not the weather. It was Grady's resignation letter. She heard about it from Pete, who heard it from the bunkhouse wall, which was the primary news transmission system of Redstone Ranch. Grady had told Callum, in a conversation that apparently had the quality of controlled detonation, that he would be leaving at the end of October. He had a position offered somewhere north, a larger operation, more cattle, a foreman's role with more authority. He had been sitting on the offer for 3 months, Pete said, which meant he had been sitting on it since before Marin arrived. Pete told her this in the cookhouse one morning with the particular intensity of someone delivering information they consider urgent. She was making bread, real bread, yeast bread, something she'd worked back into the rotation as the supply situation stabilized. And she kept working while he talked. "Does that change things?" Pete asked when he finished. "For the ranch?" She punched the dough down. "Yes, for the crew, probably. For the kitchen, not significantly." Pete watched her work the dough. "For you?" She thought about the honest answer to that for a moment before she gave it. "It removes a problem," she said. "It also removes someone who knew how this place operated for 3 years. Those aren't the same thing, but they're both true." Pete was quiet, processing this. He was getting better at sitting with complicated answers, she had noticed. At 17, he had arrived with the binary thinking that age encouraged, things were good or bad, helpful or harmful. And somewhere in the past weeks, without her making a project of it, he had started to hold more than one thing at once. "Walt said Grady's been here longer than anyone except Callum," Pete said. "I know." "Walt also said—" Pete stopped. She looked up. "Say it." "Walt said Grady used to be different, before his brother died. 3 years ago." He was picking at a loose thread on his sleeve, not looking at her. "His brother worked here too. There was an accident, winter. Grady was foreman by then, and there was some question about whether the assignment his brother was on that day was whether Grady made the right call. Nobody said it was his fault officially, but Grady said it to himself." She was still. The dough was under her hands, and she was not moving. She thought about the ladle in the dirt. She thought about the cold, systematic anger she had read in Grady since the first afternoon, and had understood his cruelty without fully understanding what it rested on. She thought about a man carrying 3 years of private verdict, the kind that no external ruling could touch because it lived below the level where external rulings had jurisdiction. She covered the bread and set it to rise. "Who told Walt?" she asked. "Grady did," Pete said. "Once. A long time ago. Walt said he's never brought it up again." She washed her hands. She stood at the basin for a moment longer than washing required. She was not going to make Grady Tollins into a sympathetic figure by the act of understanding him. Understanding a man's wound did not obligate you to absorb the damage he did because of it, but it changed the shape of what she'd been looking at, and she was honest enough with herself to let it. Grady left on a Wednesday morning in the second week of October. He did not make a ceremony of it. His gear was packed the night before and loaded on a horse before most of the crew was up. Walt shook his hand. Decker nodded. A few of the others said something she couldn't hear from the cookhouse window. Pete was watching from beside her. "You going to go out there?" he asked. "No," she said. "You're not even—" "We said what needed to be said," she said, which was not entirely true because they had said almost nothing to each other in weeks. But what she meant was that there was nothing useful left to add, and Pete was old enough to figure that out on his own. Grady walked past the cookhouse on his way to the gate. He didn't stop. She was visible through the open door. She had not closed it. And he turned his head slightly, enough to register that he saw her, and then he looked forward again and kept walking. She had decided at some point in the night after Pete told her about the brother that she was going to let him leave without a confrontation and without a reconciliation, because neither would have been honest and she did not traffic in false endings. He was leaving carrying what he'd arrived with. She couldn't fix that. She had not caused it. The most honest thing she could do was stand in her doorway and let him go. What she had not anticipated was that he would stop. He was perhaps 20 feet past the cookhouse when he stopped. She saw it in her peripheral vision, the pause in the movement, the shift of the horse's weight as he checked its walk. He stood there for a moment with his back to her. She waited. He turned around. He didn't come closer. He stood at that distance, holding his horse's lead, and looked at her across the yards between them. His face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. Not the controlled contempt she'd gotten used to, not the performing anger of the yard, but something stripped of performance. A man's face when it's tired of the mask. "I shouldn't have thrown the ladle," he said. She looked at him steadily. "And I shouldn't have said what I said." His jaw worked for a moment. "That first day, in front of everyone." The yard was not empty. Walt was near the barn. 3 other men were visible at various distances. This was not a private moment, and he was choosing it anyway, which told her something about what it had cost him to get to this particular Tuesday morning. "No," she said. "You shouldn't have." He nodded once, the way men nodded when they were accepting something that didn't feel good to accept. He turned back toward the gate. She almost let him go at that. Almost. "Grady." He stopped. She had thought about whether to say this, or something like it, through most of the previous night. She still wasn't certain it was the right thing. But she said it anyway because it was true, and because she had spent too many years watching people carry things silently that didn't have to be permanent. "Whatever happened 3 years ago," she said, "staying angry at yourself about it is your business. But taking it out on people who walked through the gate after the fact—" She paused. "That's a choice. You made it, and now you know you made it. The knowing is the beginning of the other direction." Silence. A long one. He didn't turn around again. He just stood there for a moment with his back to her, and then he walked forward, and the gate swung behind him, and he was gone. Walt appeared at the corner of the barn. He looked at the gate, then at her. She went back inside and checked on the bread. The days after Grady's departure had a quality of held breath, the ranch reorganizing around the absence of someone who had occupied significant space even when that space had been largely hostile. Callum redistributed the foreman's duties among 3 senior hands while he figured out a longer-term arrangement, which created a low-level friction among the men who each felt they were being evaluated and weren't sure by what standard. It was Walt who steadied things, as Walt tended to do, not through any particular action, but through the quality of his presence, the way he moved through disagreements with a kind of seismic calm that reminded the other men that things had been unsettled before and had settled again. Marin did her part by doing what she always did. She fed them well, and she kept the cookhouse as the one constant in a week of shifting arrangements. There was something almost tactical in it, though she didn't think of it that way. It was just what she knew how to do, and it turned out that a place where the food was reliable and the person making it was steady had an outsized effect on the mood of men who were navigating uncertainty everywhere else. Tommy Eld came to the back door on Thursday of that week, as he had every few days since Callum had given permission. He was getting less thin, she thought, or she hoped. It was hard to tell with children. They hid things well. He had started staying longer, watching her work with the same concentrated attention she'd noticed the first day. She had given him small tasks, nothing complex, nothing where a mistake would cost the kitchen anything significant. Stir this, hold that. Tell me when you think this smell's done. He was a careful child, precise in the way that children were when the cost of mistakes in their regular life was high enough that carefulness had become reflex. He rarely spoke first, but when he answered her questions, he answered them fully and without the performed casualness that children use to seem uninterested in things they desperately wanted to know. "My sister burned the cornmeal again," he said one Thursday, while stirring a pot she'd set him at. "Slower," she said, watching his arm speed. "What happened?" "She had to go outside, and when she came back—" He shook his head. "One of the first rules," she said. "You don't leave something on the fire. Not for any reason. If you need to go, you move it off the heat first." "I told her that," he said. "She doesn't listen to me because I'm older, and she thinks I'm—" He stopped. "Bossy?" Marin suggested. He looked at her. "I was going to say that she thinks I'm wrong." "Same thing sometimes." His mouth twitched. It was the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him, and it came and went fast, like it wasn't sure of its welcome. She showed him that afternoon how to bank a fire safely before leaving it, how to move the coals in a way that reduced the risk without killing the heat, the technique her father had taught her when she was younger than Tommy was now. He watched with the full-body attention he brought to everything she showed him, and she thought, not for the first time, that this child was going to be fine if he could get a little further down the road with enough to eat and someone who showed him things without making him feel small for not already knowing them. The blizzard warning came on a Friday. Not a formal warning. There was no mechanism for that in 1884, no organized system of advance notice. It came in the form of Bill Marsh, who ran the trading post at Millard Creek and who had spent 40 years reading the sky and the land and the animal behavior of that particular stretch of Wyoming territory. He sent his son out on horseback to the surrounding ranches with a message that was characteristically brief. "Bad weather coming, maybe 3 days, maybe more. Be ready." Callum came to the cookhouse immediately after the Marsh boy rode through. "How are we?" he asked. He meant the supplies. He didn't need to specify. "We're good," she said. He looked at her steadily, assessing whether she was giving him the answer he wanted to hear or the true answer. "I've been putting up since August," she said. "Root cellar has enough for 14 weeks if we're careful. We won't need to be that careful for a 3-day storm, but the cellar's ready regardless." He was quiet for a moment. 14 weeks, he said. "I didn't know when we'd need it," she said. "So I prepared for longer than I thought we would." He sat down, on the stool near the work table, which he had not done before. He'd always come to the doorway and left from the doorway. The sitting down had a quality of a man processing something that required a moment. "I've been running this ranch for 12 years, he said. "I have never—" He stopped. "Nobody has ever planned 14 weeks out for this kitchen. Ever. The way station had to plan longer than that sometimes," she said. "When the winter roads closed, we could be cut off for 6 weeks. You either had what you needed before the first snow, or you found out the hard way that you didn't." He looked at her. There was something in his face that she hadn't seen from him before in quite the same configuration. Not the provisional trust of the early weeks, not the practical approval of a man satisfied with results, but something more personal than either. "You've been doing this since August," he said, "and you never said anything." "You didn't need to know until you needed to know," she said, "and you would have worried about it, which would have been unproductive." He made a sound that was unmistakably a short laugh, surprised out of him, genuine, and immediately contained, the laugh of a man who didn't do it easily. "You decided I would have worried." "I made an educated assessment," she said. He shook his head slowly. He picked his hat up from the counter and turned it in his hands for a moment. "What do you need for the storm?" "Water stored inside before the pump might freeze. Wood brought in from the back pile and stacked inside the cookhouse, not outside it. And I need Pete for 2 hours this afternoon to help me bring things up from the root cellar and organize them by access order. What I'll need first. What can wait?" "You'll have him," Callum said. He stood. At the door he paused. She had come to expect the pause, had learned that it was where he said the things he'd been holding while the practical conversation happened. "Marin," she looked up. "Thank you," he said, "for all of this." He gestured vaguely, which she understood to mean not just the cookhouse, not just the food, but the months of work that had accumulated into something neither of them had explicitly named. "It's what I'm here for," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. "It's more than that," he said quietly. Then he left. She stood in the cookhouse for a moment after he was gone and looked at the walls, the shelves, the fire, the work table she'd scrubbed 100 times, and she felt, unexpectedly and without full preparation for it, the particular weight of having somewhere that was becoming, cautiously, hers. Not owned, not permanent in any guaranteed sense, but hers in the way that places became yours through the accumulation of work and care done within them. The blizzard hit on Saturday night. It did not arrive the way storms arrived in stories. There was no single dramatic moment of onset, no sudden white wall descending from the sky. It arrived the way real storms did, in stages. The wind first, which had been building all day in the nervous way that animals recognize before people did. Then the temperature drop, sharp and definitive, the kind that reached through walls. Then the snow, which by midnight had become the kind that moved horizontally and reduced visibility to nothing beyond 10 feet. By Sunday morning, Redstone Ranch was sealed in. The first hours of a storm like that had a particular texture. The managed chaos of men and animals being brought inside and secured, the rapid adjustments to routines that assume mobility, the low-level anxiety of a crew realizing that the perimeter of their world had suddenly contracted to the distance between buildings. Callum moved through it with the competence of a man who had weathered Wyoming winters before, making decisions quickly and delegating clearly, and by mid-morning the animals were secure and the men were inside, and the question became simply, can we wait this out? Marin had the cookhouse fire built up before the storm hit, and had kept it at a higher level than usual through the night, both for warmth and for the practical reason that having the kitchen hot made everything else in the building more manageable. She had stacked enough wood inside to last through what she estimated was the storm's duration, and she had moved her most time-sensitive supplies from the root cellar the previous afternoon when Pete had helped her carry up the organized rows she'd prepared. Now she cooked. Not because cooking was the only thing she could do, but because it was the most useful thing she could do. And in the architecture of a storm that sealed 20 men inside with limited movement and no clear endpoint, useful was what kept the walls from closing in. She made a full breakfast, more substantial than usual, understanding that men who couldn't work needed the psychological weight of a real meal to mark the day as having structure. She made coffee in quantities that kept the pot never quite empty. She started a soup in the largest pot she had, adding to it across the day in the way of long-cooked soups that deepened over hours, because the smell of it moving through the building was its own kind of warmth. She sent Pete over to the bunkhouse with the midday meal, because the men couldn't come to her in the middle of the worst of it, and Pete fought his way through the wind between buildings with the food wrapped in cloth against his chest, looking when he came back like a man who had encountered the storm's seriousness at close range and had complicated feelings about it. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Bad," he said, pulling snow off his coat. "Can't see the barn from the bunkhouse door." She nodded. She had expected that. "The men are okay," he said. "Tired of sitting. Decker started a card game, Walt's reading. 2 of the younger ones are arguing about something, but it seems mostly theoretical." She handed him a cup of coffee. "Eat something." Eat something, Pete. You went out in that." He sat down and ate, and she watched him with the specific attention of someone assessing for cold-related trouble, and he was fine, just shaken, and the food steadied him the way food did. The second day of the storm was the hardest, not because anything went wrong, nothing went wrong, which was precisely what she had planned for, but because the absence of crisis in a situation where everyone expected crisis created its own strange tension. Men who had spent the first day managing their anxiety through activity had run out of activities by the second afternoon, and the bunkhouse, Pete reported, was beginning to develop the specific atmosphere of 20 people in a confined space who were running out of patience with each other. She made something she hadn't made since the way station. It required some of her carefully preserved apple supply and the lard she'd stored, and the last of the good spices from the tin she kept in the back of the shelf, and it took 3 hours and required Pete's help and the application of the Dutch oven technique she had refined over the years to a very specific practice. It was a pie. Not beautiful. The crust was uneven in the way of crusts made without proper pie tins, improvised in what she had available, and the filling was less sweet than she would have liked. But it was a pie, recognizable, unmistakable, the specific promise of a thing that had no purpose except pleasure. She sent Pete to the bunkhouse with it still warm, wrapped in cloth. She heard it, even through the wind, even through the walls. A sound from the bunkhouse that was not argumentation and not the flat silence of men enduring. It was something between surprise and laughter, and it lasted for a moment, and then she heard nothing further, but the quality of nothing was different from what it had been before. Pete came back in 20 minutes with an empty pan. "They want to know if there's more," he said. "Tell them no," she said, "and tell them that means the pie was good, not that I'm withholding." He grinned, a real, unguarded grin, the kind he'd been producing more of in the past weeks, as if the muscle had been slowly rehabilitated. "I'll tell them the first part," he said. The storm broke on the morning of the third day. Not broke exactly. The snow stopped, but the cold remained, and the world outside was rearranged under several feet of white that would take days to negotiate. But the visibility returned, and the wind dropped, and the men could move between buildings again, and the particular suffocation of confinement lifted enough for the ranch to begin functioning. Callum went out with the senior hands to check the cattle. The news was not as bad as it could have been. The animals had sheltered as expected, and the losses were minimal, which was a different outcome than 3 neighboring ranches that sent riders over in the days following with requests that became, in some cases, something closer to appeals. The Norris operation, 6 miles north, had not stored enough food. Their cook had left in September and hadn't been replaced, and the combination of that and an inadequate root cellar and the storm's duration had put them in a position that was, while not dangerous for the men themselves, demoralizing in the specific way that being unprepared was demoralizing. Callum came to the cookhouse the afternoon the Norris rider arrived. "They need food," he said. She was already at the root cellar in her mind, calculating. How many men? 15. And Norris himself, his wife. She did the math. "I can send beans, dried apples, enough lard to cook with for 2 weeks. I won't send the cured pork, we need that here. But the beans and apples won't touch us." Callum looked at her. "You're sure?" "I prepared for 14 weeks, she said. "We're 3 days in. Yes, I'm sure." He nodded. "I'll have it loaded." She spent an hour packing what she'd promised into sacks and crates, organizing it so that what the Norris Ranch received was properly labeled and arranged by priority. She included a sheet of paper on which she wrote, in her plain hand, basic instructions for stretching the dried supplies, the rapid soak bean method, the ratio for the lard use, a note about the apple storage. She gave it to the Norris rider with the supplies without comment. He looked at the note, then at her. He was an older man, weathered in the full frontier sense of the word, and he had the expression of someone who had come expecting to negotiate for inadequate help and had received something different. "Thank you, ma'am," he said quietly. "Take care going back," she said. "It's still icy north of the second ridge." He rode out. She watched him go. Behind her, she heard Callum's voice. She hadn't realized he was still there. "You wrote them instructions," he said. "The beans are useless if they don't know how to use them quickly," she said. She turned around. He was standing in the cookhouse doorway, not quite inside, not quite outside, the threshold position he'd occupied in the early weeks and had gradually moved past. He was back in it now, but for a different reason, she thought. Not uncertainty about whether to enter, but something closer to the need to hold the frame for a moment, to look at the full picture. "There are ranches 10 miles in every direction," he said, "that did not make it through this storm as well as we did." She said nothing. "Because of what you did in August," he said. "In September, quietly, without—" He stopped. "I didn't see the full shape of it until now." She looked at him steadily. "I wasn't hiding it." "I know," he said. "I just wasn't looking for it." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been trying to figure out the right way to say that you are not—" He stopped again, and she understood that Callum Mercer, who was precise about most things, was not precise about this particular category of thing, and was aware of it. "You don't have to say it," she said. "I want to," he said. She waited. "You are not just the cook here," he said. "You haven't been for a long time, probably, but the blizzard made it visible, in a way I should have said before." She held his gaze. There was something between them in that moment that had been building in the incremental way of things that didn't announce themselves, a quiet accumulation, meal by meal and morning by morning, of something that was more than professional regard and less defined than she had language for yet. "I'm glad to be here," she said. It was a simple statement, the simplest one available, and it was true. He nodded once. He looked like a man who had more to say and had decided this was not the moment for it, which she respected. "The crew is grateful," he said. "I wanted you to know that, even the ones who don't say it." "I know," she said. "I can tell by how they eat." He almost smiled. There it was, the same almost smile she'd been cataloging since the first week. Then he went to check on the cattle, and she went back to the fire. And outside, the Wyoming winter lay over Redstone Ranch in its full, indifferent enormity. But inside, the cookhouse was warm, the stores were full, and 20 men would eat well again tonight. She had planned for that. Every single day since August, she had planned for exactly that. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself feel the full weight of what it meant to have somewhere to plan for. The weeks after the blizzard had a particular quality that Marin had experienced once before. At the way station, the winter her father got sick, and she had run the place alone for 6 weeks while he recovered in the back room. It was the quality of aftermath. The storm was gone, but its shape remained in everything. In the rearranged landscape, in the way the men moved through their days with a slightly different awareness of what the land could do to them. In the small recalibrations of a place that had been tested and had held. Redstone Ranch had held. That fact settled into the crew gradually, the way significant facts did, not announced but absorbed, becoming part of how they understood where they lived and what it meant to live there. She noticed the change in the dining room first, as she noticed most things. The men sat differently. It was subtle. Not a dramatic transformation, nothing she could have pointed to and said there, "That's the moment." But the low-grade antagonism that had been the background noise of meals since her arrival had quieted into something closer to ease. Men who had eaten in the defensive, eyes-down posture of people braced for disappointment now sat with their shoulders lower, their conversation more open, the pauses between sentences less loaded with the tension of men who didn't fully trust their circumstances. Walt noticed that she noticed. He came to the cookhouse one morning in November when Pete was out helping with fence repair and said, without preamble, "You see it." She was rendering lard, watching the heat carefully. "See what?" "The crew." He sat down on the stool. "They're different." "People are different after a storm," she said. "They're reminded of things." Reminded of what? She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything. That they need each other, she said. They spend so much of the regular time pretending they don't. Walt was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. Grady used to say that a ranch crew wasn't a family, that treating it like one made men soft. Grady was wrong about some things, she said. Not unkindly, just plainly. Walt made a sound of agreement that came from somewhere deep and settled. He was, he said. He wasn't wrong about everything. He was a good foreman with cattle, good with the work. I know, she said, but he... Walt stopped and started again. When his brother died, something in him decided that caring about things was the cause of suffering. So he stopped caring about things. He paused. Or he tried to. She didn't say anything to that. She just let it sit in the room between them, which was the appropriate response. That boy of yours is getting good, Walt said, changing the subject in the way old men did when they'd said the true thing and didn't want to circle it. Pete's not mine, she said. Near enough, Walt said, and picked up his hat and left. She stood at the fire after he was gone and thought about that. Near enough. She thought about what it meant that a 17-year-old kid who tied his boots better now and could make passable cornbread and had started asking questions that went beyond the practical. Why does salt do that? Why does timing matter? Why do you taste it at every stage? Had become, without formal arrangement, something close to her responsibility. She had not had anyone be her responsibility since her father. The way station had had travelers, yes, people she fed and sent on their way, but that was different. That was transaction, even when it was generous. Pete was something else. Pete was ongoing. She wasn't entirely sure what to do with that, so she did what she always did with things she wasn't sure about. She kept moving and let time clarify. December brought cold that was different from November's cold. Not the aggressive, dramatic cold of the blizzard, but the grinding, settled cold of a winter that had made itself at home and wasn't leaving. The kind of cold that got into the buildings and stayed there despite the fires, that found the gaps in walls and floors and made itself known at 3 a.m. when the fire had banked low. She started making soup every day. Not the same soup. She had enough variety in the stored supplies to rotate, and she was deliberate about it, understanding that a crew eating the same thing every day would lose the psychological benefit of the food no matter how good it was. Variety was its own form of nourishment. It signaled that someone was thinking about them, that the meals were curated rather than defaulted into. Decker told her once, in his characteristically direct way, that the soup on Thursdays was his favorite. She asked him what was different about Thursday soup. He thought about it and said he didn't know. It just tasted better. She knew what was different. On Thursdays, she used the bone broth she'd been building since Wednesday night, letting it reduce slowly until the flavor concentrated into something deeper than what shorter cooking achieved. But she didn't explain it to him. Some things were better received as experience than as information. Tommy Eld still came to the back door, though less frequently now that the roads were harder. When he came, he stayed longer, and his contribution to the cookhouse work had expanded beyond stirring things. He could now, without instruction, correctly assess when something needed more heat and when it needed less, which was a skill that took most adults considerable time to develop, and which he had absorbed through the particular osmosis of a child who paid attention because he understood that the knowing was directly connected to whether people in his house ate adequately. On the Tuesday before Christmas, which was not a formal holiday at Redstone, but which the calendar made present whether or not anyone acknowledged it, she sent Tommy home with a crock of preserved apple compote and a full pound of dried beans and a small piece of the cured pork. She wrapped it in cloth and tied it with the same twine she used for everything and handed it to him at the back door without ceremony. He held it with both arms, the way the package required, and looked at her. "You don't have to," he started. "I know," she said. "Take care on the road. The ice is worse near the creek." He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than the transaction required. He was looking at her with the particular expression she had come to recognize in him, the expression of a child processing something that mattered in real time, not yet sure how to hold it. "My mother wants to know your name," he said, "to tell you thank you properly." "She knows it," Marin said. "You told her." "She wants to say it herself," he said. "She says that's different." Marin looked at him for a moment. "Tell her next time the road's clear, she can come by. I'll have coffee." His face did the thing it did. The brief, unguarded thing that was almost a smile but moved faster than a smile. He went home with the package. She watched him go until the road bent and she couldn't see him anymore. And then she went back inside and put her hands in the warmth of the fire and thought about his mother, who she had never met, wanting to say her name herself because that was different. She understood that completely. The conversation with Callum happened on a Thursday evening in the 3rd week of December. Not that she had anticipated it as a conversation. Exactly. It had begun as the routine end-of-supper exchange that had been their pattern for months now. He returned his plate, they spoke briefly about practical matters. He left. It was a ritual she had come to rely on in the specific way you relied on things that were small but consistent, that marked the shape of a day. But that Thursday he came in and set down his plate and then did not move toward the door. She was washing. She kept washing, but she was aware of him in the way she had become aware of him. Not nervously, not expectantly, but with the attentiveness of someone who had learned to read a person's silences as well as their words. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said, "and I want to be straightforward about it because I've found that not being straightforward tends to produce worse outcomes than whatever discomfort the straightforwardness causes." She turned slightly and looked at him. He was standing with his hat in his hands again, turning it, which she had catalogued as the physical behavior he defaulted to when he was working through something that mattered. "The ranch," he said. "The kitchen. The position." He paused. "I'd like to make it permanent. Not provisional, not a season at a time. Permanent with a proper arrangement, pay, and the storeroom is too small." She waited. She understood there was more. "There's a room in the main house," he said. "The east room off the hall. It's been used for storage for a while. It has 2 windows. It's a proper room." He stopped, started again. I'm not conflating things that are separate things. I mean, a room that's appropriate for someone who is not a temporary laborer passing through, but who is—" He stopped again. She turned fully and looked at him. He met her eyes. "Someone who belongs here," he said. "That's what I'm trying to say." The cookhouse was quiet except for the fire. Outside, the wind moved through the winter night with the low, consistent moan that had become the background of December at Redstone. She had thought about this. Not this conversation specifically. She hadn't let herself anticipate specific conversations, because anticipating them meant investing in outcomes she couldn't control. But she had thought about the question underneath it, whether this was a place, whether she was a person who could let a place be a place, after years of motion and loss and the particular freedom of having nothing to protect. Freedom and having nothing were not the same thing. She had known that for a long time. It was a different thing to live from. "The room in the main house," she said carefully, that would require the crew to understand what that arrangement meant and doesn't mean." "The crew respects you more than they respect most things at this ranch," he said, "including me on some days." "That's not an answer." "No," he said, "it's not." He was quiet for a moment. "What it means is that you are not the cook who might leave in spring. What it means is that this ranch is different with you here, and I am different with you here, and I would like that to continue, and I would like it to be settled, formally settled." He paused. "I'm not articulate about this, I know that, but I'm being honest." She considered him for a long moment. Callum Mercer, who had buried a wife and built a ranch on borrowed money, and who managed 20 men's worth of complexity with a competence that was real and a loneliness that was just as real, visible to anyone who knew how to look for it. Who had stood in a yard and stopped the performance long enough to give her a chance. Who had defended her quietly and consistently and without making a spectacle of it. Who turned his hat in his hands when he was talking about something that mattered. "The room would need to be cleaned out," she said. He was still for a moment. Processing, she thought, the fact that she had responded to the practical implication, which was the closest she had to a yes. "I'll have Pete do it," he said. "Pete will complain about the spiders again." "He'll manage," Callum said. Something moved in his face, the near smile, but slower this time, fuller, the way it looked when it wasn't being held back quite so firmly. She dried her hands on the cloth she kept at the basin. "I'll want to keep the storeroom for overflow storage," she said. "Kitchen storage specifically. The main house room is separate from the kitchen." "Of course," he said. "And the arrangement between us," she said because she needed to say it plainly, "moves at the pace it moves. I don't do things because the situation implies I should. I do them when they're right." "I know that about you," he said. "I've known that since August." She looked at him. She believed him. That was the thing. She looked at him and she believed him, which was not something she had been able to say about many people in her life. And she was old enough and had been through enough to understand what it was worth. "All right," she said. He nodded once. He put his hat on. At the door he paused, and she braced for the pause, for whatever came in it. "Marin?" he said. "Yes." "The crew." "The difference in this place." He stopped, started again. "You answered cruelty with better work. You answered a bad situation with preparation. You answered—" He shook his head slightly. "I watched you do it for months, and I don't think I've said directly that I saw it, that I understand what it cost." She was quiet for a moment. "It didn't cost as much as you might think," she said. "It was just what I knew how to do." "That's what I mean," he said quietly, and left. She stood in the cookhouse for a long moment after he was gone, looking at the fire, listening to the wind, feeling the particular weight of a life that had, without announcement, without the dramatic arrival she might once have imagined for such a thing, found its shape. Spring came the way springs came in Wyoming, reluctantly, in fits, with cold snaps that reasserted winter's claim twice in March and once in early April, before the land finally accepted the change. The creek ran high and fast with snowmelt. The cattle moved differently, recognizing the new season before the humans did. The mud was extraordinary. She moved into the east room of the main house in late March. Pete had cleaned it out with only moderate complaint about the spiders, and Callum had replaced the window glass on the south side that had developed a crack over winter. The room had a view of the kitchen garden that she had planned to start in April, a practical garden, herbs and root vegetables, nothing decorative. And in the mornings, the light came in at an angle that was different from the storeroom's light, fuller. And she was aware of it as an improvement without being able to entirely relax into it, because improvements that came after a long time without them required adjustment. She was not entirely comfortable in the main house yet. She suspected she would not be for a while, and she accepted that without making a problem of it. These things took the time they took. What she was comfortable in was the cookhouse, which had not changed except to become more fully itself. Her reorganizations and routines so established now that the room seemed to have been arranged this way always, that any visitor walking in would have had difficulty imagining it any other way. This was, she knew, one of the quiet successes of the work, when the thing you built stopped looking built and started looking inevitable. Pete turned 18 in April. She made him a cake. This required some improvisation. Eggs from the trading post woman, who had continued sending them periodically with the supply wagon and the last of the winter's spice tin, and a controlled negotiation with the Dutch oven that did not go perfectly. The top was slightly uneven, and the second layer listed to the left. She put it in front of him at breakfast, just him and her in the cookhouse before the crew came in, and he looked at it with an expression she would keep. "It's a cake," he said. "It's your birthday," she said. He looked at it for another moment. He was trying not to show that it affected him, which was the age he was. 18, old enough to feel things deeply, and young enough to consider depth embarrassing. "My mother used to—" He stopped. "I know," she said. She didn't know exactly, but she knew the shape of what he meant. He ate 2 pieces, which was more than the cake probably deserved given the listing, and he didn't mention the imperfection, and neither did she. What she said to him after, while they were cleaning up before the crew arrived, was something she had been thinking about for weeks, without knowing she was going to say it. "You're good in this kitchen," she said. "You have a real sense for it. Not just following instruction, actual intuition." He stopped wiping down the counter. He was listening in the way he listened when something mattered, with his whole body, not just his face. "I don't know what your plans are," she said. "I don't know if this is where you want to stay, or if there's somewhere else. You're 18, and that's the age for figuring that out, not for having already figured it out." "I don't have anywhere specific to go," he said. "That's not what I asked." He was quiet for a moment. "I like it here," he said. "I didn't expect to. When I signed on in April last year, I was just trying to—" He shook his head. "But I like it here." "That's enough for now," she said. "Liking it here is enough." He nodded slowly. Did you—" He was struggling with the question's formation. "Is that what happened with you? You just liked it here?" She considered the honest answer. It was more complicated than yes and less complicated than a full explanation. "I liked that it needed what I had," she said. That's where it started. The liking came later. He thought about that with the serious, complete attention he brought to things he was trying to actually understand rather than just hear. Then he nodded, once, and went back to wiping down the counter. The kitchen garden she planted in April became, by June, a source of things she hadn't had access to since the way station. Fresh herbs that were entirely different from dried ones. Not better, necessarily, but different, with a brightness that changed what you could do. Early lettuces that she put on the table simply, with vinegar and a little of the rendered lard she kept for dressings, and which the crew received with the specific surprise pleasure of men encountering something they hadn't known they were missing. Tommy Eld's mother came in May. Her name was Ruth, and she was younger than Marin had pictured, somewhere in her mid-30s, though worn in the way that particular life wore people. She came alone, on foot, which meant she had walked the 2 miles, which meant this mattered to her enough to walk. She came to the cookhouse door and introduced herself. Marin had been expecting her and had coffee ready and a plate of the biscuits she made on Wednesdays. Ruth sat down across the work table from her and wrapped her hands around the coffee cup and said, "Tommy talks about you every day." "He's a good student," Marin said. "He's a good boy," Ruth said, with the specifically fierce quality of mothers saying true things. "He's always been a good boy. The circumstances—" She stopped. "You don't need to explain," Marin said. "I want to," Ruth said. "I want you to know that I know what you've done. The food and the teaching him things. He comes home and he tries things in the kitchen. Last month he made a soup that was—" Her voice changed quality. "It was the best thing I'd eaten in a long time." Marin set down her cup. "He moved the heat down," she said. Ruth looked at her. "That's what made the difference," Marin said. "He learned to move the heat down at the right moment. Most people don't learn that without being told multiple times. He got it on the second telling." Ruth looked at her with an expression that was trying to contain more than expressions usually contained: gratitude and grief and pride, and the particular exhaustion of a woman who had been holding a difficult situation together with her hands for a long time and had not recently had someone speak well of something she'd made. "Thank you," Ruth said. Not the brief transactional thank you, the other kind. They sat and drank coffee and talked, not about the difficult things, not about Ruth's husband or the debt or the winter, but about ordinary things, about the garden that was coming in, about what grew well in that particular soil, about the way certain things that were hard to grow somewhere else thrived in this specific climate if you understood what the land wanted to give you rather than insisting on what you wanted to take from it. Ruth left 2 hours later with a bundle of early herbs from the garden and a promise to come back when she could. Marin stood in the doorway of the cookhouse and watched her walk back down the road and thought about the network of small things, the daily plates left on the fence rail, the 3 pieces of knowledge given to a 12-year-old who needed them, the soup that was the best thing a tired woman had eaten in a long time, and how they connected to each other in ways that were invisible until you stood at the right angle. She was not a woman who believed in grand gestures. She had seen enough of them to know they rarely did what they promised. What she believed in was the daily thing, the consistent small choice, the plate set on a fence rail without announcement, the right amount of heat applied at the right moment. That was the thing she had known since she was 19 years old, watching her father at a pot in a snowstorm and not yet believing him. That the work itself was the point, not the recognition of it. That feeding people was not a transaction, but a practice, like any craft that required years of repetition before it became fluent. She had become fluent here. She could feel it in the way the cookhouse ran now, in the automatic knowledge of what was needed without having to think about needing to know it, in the crew's relationship to the kitchen as a place that was dependable in the way the best things in a hard life were dependable, not dramatic, not showy, just there. On a Friday evening in late June, with the long summer light lying flat and golden across the Wyoming land and the smell of the kitchen garden coming through the open cookhouse window, supper ran late. It ran late because Decker had told a story at the table that made Walt laugh. Actually laugh. A real, unself-conscious laugh that nobody at Redstone Ranch had heard before, that turned out to be surprisingly large for a quiet man. And the laughter had spread the way laughter did when it was genuine, and 3 men who had been about to leave stayed instead, and then 3 more, and the dining room had a quality she had not expected and could not have planned. She stood in the cookhouse doorway and looked at them. 20 men. Some of them changed from the ones she'd first served, some of the same, all of them here, all of them fed, all of them in this specific moment not thinking about the hard season behind them or the hard season ahead, but about Decker's story, whatever it was, and Walt's large, surprised laugh. Pete appeared beside her. He had been cleaning up and had stopped when he heard the laughter. He looked at the room. He looked at her. "You did that," he said. "I made supper," she said. "That's not what I mean." She knew what he meant. She just wasn't going to agree to it out loud because agreeing to it out loud felt like the kind of thing that invited the world to test whether it was true, and she was superstitious enough about good things to keep quiet about them. Callum came to the cookhouse that night later than usual, after the men had gone and the laughter had given way to the ordinary sounds of a ranch settling for the night. He returned his plate. He looked at her. "Good supper," he said. "It was a good night," she said. He stood in the doorway, not the old, uncertain threshold position, but his own version of it now, the version that was a habit of affection rather than hesitation, and looked at her with the expression she had catalogued and collected over a year's worth of evenings, the expression that was always slightly more than he said. "You know what I've been thinking about," he said. "Tell me," she said. "That first night," he said, "the crew at the table, the silence when everyone took a bite." He paused. "I knew then. I didn't let myself think it through, but I knew." "Knew what?" she said, though she understood the shape of what he was going to say. "That you weren't going to leave," he said, "and that was—" He stopped. That felt important in a way I couldn't account for immediately. She looked at him for a moment, at this careful, honest man who ran a ranch with competence and carried loneliness with the same competence, and who had stood in a yard and made one right decision against the laughter of his own crew and had not known what it would become. "I wasn't planning to leave," she said. "I didn't have anywhere to go." "I know," he said. "But staying because you have nowhere else and staying because you want to stay. Those become different things eventually." She was quiet for a moment. The fire was low behind her. The kitchen garden moved in the evening air outside the window. The cookhouse smelled of everything she had made in it over the past year, the accumulated record of 300 and some odd meals, embedded in the walls the way smells embedded in places that had been lived in. "They became different things a while ago," she said. He nodded slowly. The near smile arrived, and this time it went all the way. She turned back to the fire and banked it for the night, and he stood in the doorway for another moment before he said goodnight and walked toward the main house, and she followed a few minutes later, walking the same path across the yard she had walked every evening for a year. The stars above Wyoming were unreasonable in their abundance, the kind of sky that made you aware of your own smallness without making you feel small, if that distinction made any sense, and she had come to think it did. The land around Redstone was dark and enormous and entirely indifferent to her in the way land was, and she was exactly one person in an enormous country that didn't know her name. But the cookhouse knew it, the crew knew it, the root cellar was full of things she'd put there with her own hands. Pete knew how to move the heat down at the right moment. Tommy Eld had made a soup that was the best thing his mother had eaten in a long time. Walt had laughed a laugh nobody at this ranch had heard before. Decker had stayed at the table for a story. She had walked through a gate 8 months ago with $2.14 in a handkerchief and a worn satchel, and 4 days of walking in her legs, and hunger that had gone past the sharp stage into the dull, patient stage, and a man had thrown a ladle at her feet. She had not thrown it back. She had asked for a chance to cook one meal. She had cooked it with stale flour and old salt pork and dried onions and molasses, and 20 men had gone quiet with the specific quiet of people receiving something they hadn't expected. She had earned that night, and then the next, and then the one after. That was the whole of it, and the whole of it was enough. Not because the world had been fair to her, it hadn't, in the accounting of things, been particularly fair, but because the work itself had been real, and the people it had reached had been real, and the mornings of the storeroom and then the east room with the better light were real, and the kitchen garden was real, and the year's worth of honest labor was a thing that existed now in the world and could not be untaken. She went inside. The fire in the main house was low but present. The east room waited with its 2 windows. In the morning she would be up before anyone else, and the fire in the cookhouse would need to be going by 4:30, and Pete would appear in the doorway with his hat on and his boots already tied, and the day's first meal would need to be built from what the day had available. She was not afraid of that. She had never been afraid of that. She had been afraid of other things, of not being enough, of being forgotten in the way people who moved through too many places got forgotten, of the specific loneliness of competence without belonging, of working hard for years and finding at the end of it that you had built nothing that held your shape when you stepped out of it. She was less afraid of those things now. Not because they had been resolved by some clean story logic that tied everything together, But because the East Room held her shape when she stepped out of it, and the cookhouse held it, and a crew of 20 men sat down to supper and stayed past the end of it because someone had told a story that made Walt laugh. And that was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. She lay down in the East Room with its 2 windows, and the Wyoming night pressed its full dark weight against the glass. And she was not a woman who had been saved or rescued or redeemed by anyone's grace except her own sustained, daily, imperfect effort. She was just a woman who knew how to cook, who had learned that knowing how to do one thing honestly and doing it every single day in full for the people in front of you, that this was not a small thing, it was the whole thing. She closed her eyes and slept. And in the morning, the fire needed starting, and there were 20 men to feed, and a kitchen garden coming in, and a boy who was getting less thin, and a year of spring and summer and fall and winter in front of her, that she would navigate the same way she had navigated every day since she walked through that gate. One meal at a time. That had always been enough. It had turned out to be more than enough. It had turned out to be a life.